Guys, if you're looking to expand your collection or upgrading your current roster with a bit more armor, this video is for you because we're going to talk about top 5 Space Marine vehicles and the stuff that is most efficient to buy, both in terms of its current performance in the meta and also how useful and long-lasting it's going to be in your collection. So without further ado, let's dive right in. First one is a pair of Repulsor and Repulsor Executioner. So both versions of this transport/tank are very good now and they deserve your attention as a part of a collection potentially. Price-wise, the Repulsor is 180 points and the Repulsor Executioner is 220. Significantly more expensive, and I think, to be honest, if not for the awful thing that is the Space Marine Iron Storm that has all these transports plus the new Oath of Moment, especially when they have Guilliman together, this package itself is a bit obnoxious. But in general, for a Space Marine tank, I think the Repulsor Executioner is a bit on the more too expensive side. I think the better cost for it would be 210 points, but again, we cannot really price it like that because in Iron Storm it's almost busted, whereas for most other detachments I think it's reasonable and maybe even slightly too expensive. But that's besides the point. Both are very good. They occupy different roles though. So Repulsor is a transport through and through, so it can shoot reasonably well, much better than a Rhino, but it is still a transport at heart, and you are getting it into your roster with an idea that you're going to be carrying something inside, something that benefits from the 10-inch move that the transport provides. Repulsor Executioner, on the other hand, is a totally reverse story. So it is a tank that also has a few seats available inside, and to be honest, in most of my rosters, apart from, again, Iron Storm, I found that it's much easier for me to find a place for Repulsor than to find a place for Repulsor Executioner, because I really always want to find something that I want to put inside those 7 seats that it has, but the 7-seat configuration is only really useful for when you want to transport something like a 6-man squad of inner circle companions plus a character, and it's not always like the most efficient thing you want to do. Plus, the idea of a tank is usually to stay slightly behind the front line of your army, and also be in the most defensible position in terms of terrain, somewhere where it's least visible and also has the best lines of sight to shoot at something. And this does not really work well with it as a transport, because transport wants to be as close as possible to like the furthest ruin inside your deployment or just outside of your deployment, and then move out and again find a ruin where it can stay for as long as necessary for your units to then disembark, use those extra 3 inches they get for disembarking, and then also move out. Though you can still disembark after the transport moves, it just means that you are going to be utilizing something that is shooty, not a melee unit inside, because obviously melee units cannot really charge after they disembark from a transport that moved, unless it's a Land Raider, which these guys aren't. So if you have an idea for maybe like a 5-man starting out veteran squad with a captain, and you want to put that inside the Repulsor Executioner, that could work. Anyhow, the Repulsor has 14 seats, and again, it's 7 on Repulsor Executioner, so you can pretty much fit anything that you want comfortably inside. It can be even a 7-man squad of Gravis armor, so full a 6-man squad of Eradicators or Aggressors with a Gravis captain, or any Gravis character for that matter. What I personally like really to have inside the Repulsor is something like a 6-man squad of Eradicators. I personally run this particular combination in my competitive roster of Ultramarines recently, and I really liked it because 6-man unit of Eradicators, despite it being slightly more expensive than it was before at 200 points, it's still extremely good in terms of damage output, especially now with +1 to wound from Oath. So you are really getting a lot of oomph from that unit inside the Repulsor, and the transport itself is not as expensive that if you lose it, you will lose half your army, and it also provides a reasonable amount of shooting output itself. And talking about that, you get 3 good shots, anti-tank shots from the Repulsor, 1 from the twin-linked las cannon, and 2 shots from the las Talem, I think it's called, and also a bunch of 401 shots, so something that you would use against chaff units. But to be honest, sometimes, like if you're shooting at a monster, maybe like a greater demon with a bad armor save, and you are peppering it with those shots, and you have +1 to wound from oath and reroll hits, you can get a few wounds from that into the demon as well. So don't forget about that. Repulsor Executioner bumps that up significantly with 2 shots at strength 16 AP4 and damage D6 +4. So you get that instead of the 3 sort of like medium strength anti-tank shots. And you also get a heavy bolter, you also get a Gatling cannon, which has 12 shots at 601 with devastating wounds, no twin linked unfortunately, so you cannot fish for those devastating wounds, and slightly fewer 401 anti-infantry shots. What I really like about these ones is that both are toughness 12, 16 wounds, and unfortunately 3+ save, but at least they are tough and they have a lot of wounds. So especially for the Repulsor, if your opponent wants to open up that transport, they need to put some real firepower into it. I've had mine survive, I think, 2 Doomsday Arcs, and only the 3rd one finished it off, which was exactly what I needed because I wanted my Dreadnoughts, which were surrounding the tank, to survive and not take that firepower. So the Repulsor is also good at soaking up damage, and when you lose it, it's only 180 points. Not something that you want to lose necessarily, but it's not something you would cry over, and that's what I love about it. Repulsor Executioner, on the other hand, is just amazing in Ironstorm. If you like that kind of roster style, it works amazingly well there. And for balanced lists, it still has that interesting capability of transporting some infantry inside, and also has a really good gun on top of it. So really good transport to have. And also what I love about this, if you are crafty enough, you can, if you know what you're doing with the 3D printer, you can find a way to make your Repulsor Executioner into a normal Repulsor and vice versa. So that's just something you might want to do if you want to save up on buying several of these transports, which they are very expensive. As always, I want to remind you about my Patreon 40K coaching service. If you're looking for help building your competitive rosters, preparing you for tournaments, or have any questions about your collection in general, check out the links for my Patreon in the description. Thank you. Next is the Gladiator Lancer. So just for collection purposes, by saying Gladiator Lancer, I mostly mean anything that is Gladiator or Impulsor. If you are really going to buy this expensive piece of kit, you want to make sure that you have magnetized everything and you have all the versions built, so you are not wasting your money. Because if you just glue everything together and you have just the Gladiator Lancer, you've just lost 2 versions of a Gladiator and also an Impulsor. So you've essentially cut off 3 options of a tank from your collection. Don't do that. 160 points is its current cost, and the reason why you would want to run this tank is because you might want to have something in your roster that can do good anti-monster, anti-vehicle damage at a distance, from any distance whatsoever on the table, without extra help from rerolls. So that's the beauty of the Lancer, is that despite it still benefiting technically from the Oath, it's rare that you will need it, because you need to miss both your shots for that to matter, and considering it only has 2 shots, it's unlikely. And if you are shooting with it, you have a reroll to hit, a reroll to wound, and a reroll to damage. So you are covered throughout your journey of trying to wound enemy vehicle or monster. And the gun on it is a very good one. It's strength 14 AP4 and damage D6 +3. I especially love the AP4 because it's a very common nowadays to see 2+ save tanks hiding in cover, and that just makes something like AP2 guns not really interesting enough against tanks, especially if you don't have access to ignoring cover, which you might not, depending on which detachment you're running. And yes, you need a couple of these to really work as anti-tank, anti-monster, because to be honest, like even 2 Lancers in a list is not enough to provide enough adequate anti-tank firepower nowadays, unless you have a lot of it elsewhere. So if you're running like Jump Pack Blood Angels lists where every single unit of yours can technically flip a tank on its own, you might be enough just adding 2 Lancers and maybe like an Inceptor squad. But for any other normal balanced list where you don't have Jump Pack Marines that are capable of reaching enemy tanks turn 2 at a maximum, I would go for having more, significantly more than just 2 Lancers. Still, even two Lancers are a formidable danger for any kind of vehicle, especially one that doesn't have an invulnerable save. So, because if you are trying to go through a 4-up in one, that is always a casino, because it does not matter what your AP is, it just can happen so that your opponent rolls 2 4s and ignores your tank completely, or even 1 4 if you have failed on one of your rolls. However, if you are targeting something like a Rhino that doesn't have an invulnerable save, even in cover, they'll only have a 6-up to help them, and it's not really good enough, and you can just destroy a Rhino with a single volley from a Lancer. So really good thing to have in your collection. Please magnetize it, because you are not going to regret it. And also have it as an impulsor as an option, because you are painting the whole hull. You might as well paint a few extra bits that are necessary to make it an impulsor, and just essentially like a top cover part, and all those extra bits like the shield dome and the Icarus Iron Halo, whatever thingy on top. Just paint a couple of those, magnetize them, and you're gonna have also a transport option, which is why Gladiator is in place 4, despite it not being like the most reliable shooting power out of all the ones that we're gonna look at today. Next is Ballistus Dreadnought. So we've seen a resurgence of these ones ever since they became 130 points, after they got a discount from 140. Later we received a buff to Oath of Moment, which made them even better. And now that the Iron Storm lists are on the rise again, they are really amazing, these Dreadnoughts. But even if you're not playing Iron Storm, they are still a very valid option. And reason for that is you are buying essentially a fire base, because you're not really buying one ballista. If you're going to run these Dreadnoughts, you are gonna buy at least 2, probably 3 of these, and 3 of these is a fire base that actually does quite a lot of damage. I've seen with my own 2 eyes a single Ballistus Dreadnought kill a full Armiger Knight in one volley, and that was not fun. That was an Iron Storm Ballistus, but it was definitely not great for the player on the other side, which by the way was Anna, my wife, which you might know from the other videos on the channel. Reason for that is the Ballistus actually has 4 pretty good anti-tank shots, so the only thing that you just need to do in order to have a result like that is just roll high on the damage, which can happen sometimes, and that's the beauty of the last cannons and the missiles, is that D6 is a D6. And yes, quite often you're gonna roll those 1s and 2s, but if you don't, if you roll 5s and 6s, anything that is a vehicle is going to go down relatively quickly. And the reason why +1 to wound from the new Oath is so meaningful is because the Ballistus has the sweet spot of strength 10 and strength 12 shots on its gun, so 12 on the last cannon, 10 on the crack missiles, and getting +1 to wound essentially moves you from wounding on 4s and 5s sometimes to maybe like 3s, 4s and 5s to 2s, 3s and 4s, and that is a big jump, especially if you are shooting something like a Doomsday Arc, which is toughness 9 base, so you would be wounding it on 2s. Another great thing about the Ballistus is that it is really not reliant on Oath of Moment that much, which is controversial. I know I just said that it loves the +1 to wound, but if you have already used up the Oath of Moment and you have killed the target that is oathed, you will at least have the hit reroll part, thanks to Ballistus's ability that if it shoots at something that is not below half strength, so it's not half dead, you are gonna get rerolls to hit. And rerolls to hit is not full oath, but it's still the most important part of it, I would say. Also, Ballistus is a toughness 10, 2+ save, and 12 wound Dreadnought, so the same chassis as the Redemptor, minus the -1 damage, which, to be honest, Redemptor is a whopping 80 points more expensive than a single Ballistus, so you cannot really hold it against the Ballistus that it doesn't also have the -1 damage. That is really a really good defensive profile. Anything short from a direct anti-tank solution is not going to get rid of Ballistus quickly, and honestly, the Redemptors often encounter a problem where they are being shot by something like a Melter with D6 +2 damage, and that does not really care that much for the -1 that the Redemptor has. If you are being attacked by a bunch of Wardens, for example, yes, you're going to have the best day ever with damage 2 on those spears, but often nowadays vehicles are shot by guns that are very high damage, and the higher the damage, the less relevant -1 damage becomes. Plus, the fact that the Ballistus is so cheap makes it even less appealing of a target. It almost doesn't feel worth it to shoot at the Ballistus when your opponent has something more expensive in the army, and that might be a big mistake. Also, Ballistus is a Dreadnought, toughness 10 Dreadnought, so it can use the tank shock stratagem pretty well. So if something comes too close, you have always that option to roll a bunch of dice and maybe do like 3 or 4, maybe even more mortal wounds, up to 6. If you're not running the vanilla Space Marines, I think you might want to do Ballistus to use it in the rosters, but if you are running the Space Marines that get +1 to wound on oath, definitely get a couple or maybe even 3 of these in your list, because it just makes so many things easier for you and so much harder for your opponent, believe me. Package of 3 Ballistas plus 6 Inceptors looks to me like a very inconvenient for your opponent and very reliable and powerful for you way to get some good amount of shooting into a roster. Plus, the versatility of having the frag profile on the missiles means that, and also like a couple of shots from the Stormbolter, means that you're not only locking yourself into the anti-tank profile like the Gladiator Lancer, for example. You have something extra to use if you are not really interested in using the big guns profile. And the next is Redemptor Dreadnought. So for 210 points, you are getting the same package as the Ballistas in terms of defense stats, but also -1 damage, as we discussed. And yes, I said it's very expensive, and yes, I said that often you're going to encounter high damage, which not ignores the -1 damage, but makes it less relevant. But believe me, there are a lot of things in the game that rely on damage 2, and even damage 3 for that matter, and they hate going up against Redemptors, for a good reason, because if you're losing half of your efficiency when you're going into something, it will hurt. There are just not a lot of units in the Space Marine Codex that do anything similar to what the Redemptor does. By similar, I mean how versatile it is. It both fights really well in combat, it still can tank shock, obviously. It has a lot of shooting on top of it. It has Icarus shots, it has Stormbolter or Fragstorm launcher, it has the Onslaught Gatling cannon, and the amazing plasma cannon. And that plasma cannon is the reason why I put it in second place here, because now with +1 to wound from Oath, the biggest problem that the plasma had, which is the lower strength 9 on it, is essentially solved. Now that you are wounding any tank in the game on 4s or better, you are going to have a lot of good output from it. 4 was just too unreliable against those higher toughnesses, because wounding on 5s, even with rerolls, is not fun. Without rerolls, is just not reliable enough for anything that is going to be your main anti-tank firepower. If you had some other anti-tank firepower in the list, this could be a good way to finish something off, but you could not rely on it solely. So it's a very durable, very good in shooting, pretty good in melee package, and that's exactly why it costs so much, because if everyone could buy 3 Redemptors for 150 points, we would just see 3 Redemptors on every single table and every single event forever. However, now you are paying for that versatility, you are paying dearly, one could say, but you're also getting a lot in return. Those damage 3 AP 4 shots on the D6 +1 shot plasma cannon with +1 to wound are just beautiful. I love them. Once again, Redemptor proves that it's a very long-lasting unit. It has amazing longevity for your collection, so not having it in your collection, I think, is a mistake. Yes, you're gonna pay like, I think, 80 or 90 even dollars, whatever it is now, for a single box, but it is worth it, especially if you magnetize it and you're not gonna have the problem of, oh, now the Gatling cannon is the best gun in a year or so. So if you can take out the high AP and high damage guns soon enough with your other shooting and the Redemptors themselves, because the plasma is also 36-inch range with their 8-inch move, it's a very big threat range, so you're almost always covering the whole table with that. And if you can take those guns out, everything else is gonna really struggle to kill even a single Redemptor, let alone 2 or 3 of those. And number 1, the victor of this top 5 of today, is the Vindicator. So 175 points for this tank, and he is, in my opinion, the current reigning king of the marine vehicles. The reason for that is because, in my humble opinion, it's the best tank, comparatively speaking, as it combines toughness 11, 11 wounds, and 2+ save, so really good durability. It is cheaper than, say, a Redemptor. It doesn't have the -1 damage, obviously, but it is protected by the higher toughness and the same 2+ armor save. It doesn't need +1 to wound to work, so that's why those Dark Angels or Blood Angels lists that are not vanilla, so that cannot use the +1 to wound from oath, they are relying on Vindicators, because Strength 14 doesn't really care that much about +1 to wound. Moreover, it will be wounding things that are toughness 7 on 2s, which is just amazing, like Alarus or Paragon Warsuits or a bunch of other things that are toughness 7 or lower. The gun has a lot of shots. It's D6 plus 3 of those shots at AP3 for whatever reason, and D6 damage. So it's gonna do well against Terminators, tanks, monsters. You can even shoot it at like lower wound count infantry if you have no other targets, and it's still going to be relatively efficient because it has Blast. Yes, it is a roulette gun, so you are really at the mercy of how well you can roll the number of shots, but not as much even as the Redemptor one, because Redemptor one is D6 plus 1, where here you get at least guaranteed 4 shots, and 4 shots is not bad. That's why you want to account for that randomness by running 2 or 3 of these guys, otherwise the stats can just go the wrong way and you will lose the whole shooting phase, and that can flip the game on its own. The Vindicators are good enough to build your entire shooting phase on them. I would still have access to something like Advance and Shoot for them, because they only are move 9, and move 9 with a 24-inch gun can be a tough spot for maybe like if your opponent is hiding from you or keeping as far as possible, pre-measuring, God forbid, which would be a really bad thing if you are not pre-measuring yourself, and they just make sure that you cannot get in range of them. That's why you want to have Advance and Shoot, because then they have to pre-measure for your maximum distance of 9-inch move, 24-inch gun, plus 6-inch advance, and that usually is enough to deter them from even trying. Also, you're not really going for long-range shootouts with Vindicators anyways. You're probably parking them as far as possible closer to the edge of your deployment zone right away, and then moving out and staying relatively in the open. Like, no, I don't mean necessarily in the open when you don't need to, but it will be somewhere like where you have all the lines of sight to the objectives in no man's land, and from there you are probably going to be within 24-inch range anyways. And also, Vindicator cannot be tagged. It doesn't care about say something being in combat, because it ignores the penalty for -1 to hit when you are in combat with him. If you're looking to upgrade the shooting potential of your list, you are not going to regret getting a couple or even 3 Vindicators into your roster. The worst part about the Vindicator now is that it's a firstborn vehicle, which means that when the 11th edition comes out, and that should be summer 2026, we might lose the Vindicator, or it can be much worse, because those like firstborn vehicles often are prone to wild swings in how good or bad they are. If you're okay in investing your hard-earned money into something that is a bit of an older kit, then Vindicator is really good for you. If you will be okay with even losing it outright, it comes 11th edition, then I highly recommend it. If you want to have the more long-lasting stuff, that was places 5 through 2, and those will all serve you well for years to come. That was my top 5 Space Marine vehicles that I highly recommend to get into your collection now. Please tell me what is your favorite vehicle that you have in your roster now, because I very well might have missed a thing that might be even more efficient than these 5, though I doubt it, because these are really good. And thank you for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.